Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. For this lecture today, we are going to talk about the powers of the state. In our previous meeting, we have discussed about the state. Now, let's take a look at what are the basic powers of the state, as these three powers are very important later on in your case studies that I have given to you as part of this course. And as such, the powers of the state are fundamental to our understanding of society in the Philippines and its governance, as these will define the policies and programs that we are often subjected to as citizens of the country, that is. So the fundamental powers of the state are the following. We have police power, eminent domain, and taxation. So we will go over them. We will go over them one by one, as we will define what are these powers of the state and why are they fundamental in the first place. Well, fundamental powers of the state means that they are inherent in the state. They are not expressly conferred by the Constitution, but they are let's say inherent in the sense that they are already there when the state came into being. And so these are innate attributes. So these are, let's say, default already in the state. These are indispensable and necessary, because without the exercise of these powers, the state cannot continue to exist. And these are the primary means by which the state interferes with our private rights as individuals. We will talk more about your private rights later when we get to the section on Bill of Rights. Then as inherent powers of the state, perhaps we can even say that this is a means to counterbalance not only our private rights, but also as a means to promote even the way that we to promote our well-being as citizens, in the sense that these powers are fundamentally exercised for the purpose of the public or for public purposes. Okay, and these are primarily exercised by the legislature via the creation of laws. Okay, now there are limitations to this exercise of the inherent powers of the state, the power of taxation, police, and eminent domain. So it is subjected to limitations and requirements by the Constitution, and may in proper cases be annulled by the courts of justice if found to be not properly exercised. So these may not be exercised arbitrarily to the prejudice of the Bill of Rights. Individuals need to be protected from this awesome power of the state per se. Powers of the state, rather. So let's first talk about police power. Now I think you're maybe thinking, well, is this when the state calls out the police? You say police, the PNP, the Philippine National Police. Yes and no. We will get to that later. Okay. So the police power of the state basically is the power of the state to enact such laws or regulations in relation to persons and property as may promote public health, public morals, public safety, and general welfare and convenience of the people. So remember the key term here, public. Okay? Public. So the power of promoting public welfare by restraining or regulating the use of liberty and property. For example, when a national curfew or when a state of emergency is decreed on a national scale, that is an exercise of police power. When the military is called out to quell an unrest, for example, that is also an exercise of police power. In a sense, the use of police power is very critical for us as individuals because it is pervasive. Of all the three powers, it is perhaps the most pervasive one because, as we mentioned earlier, restraining or regulating the use of liberty is how usually police power is exercised. Okay? So, as I mentioned, it is the most pervasive one and least limitable and most demanding of the three powers. Basically, when you exercise the police power, you're opening a Pandora's box every time you do so. No, we can even look at an infamous exercise of police power in the form of the war on drugs by the current administration, which resulted in many deaths by many people, no? Or the many deaths of many people over the course of the past 5 years. So, going back to the discussion, police power cannot be bargained away, and it can also be exercised via, let's say, via as a form of, perhaps we can say, taxation. Later on we will talk about the sin tax, no, taxes on certain vices like alcohol tax, cigarette tax. There's even a proposed sugar tax and vape tax, no, and those can be considered as um, part of what is categorically called as a sin tax per se, no, taxes on vices that people take, and that can be considered as an exercise of police power. And even the regulation of property, the for example, the demolishing of property can be considered as an exercise of police power if it endangers the public. So police power is very dynamic. It changes with society. Now we can see many different phases of police power every day, going from police raids into suspected drug dens, and even into, let's say, as simple as a curfew at night, or perhaps even simpler than that, uh, pedestrian crossings, no, pedsings as we know them. So even taxation is, well, as I mentioned this already, so let's proceed. So the basis of police power, and this is where the key term public comes in once again, the basis of this is all about public welfare, as as highlighted by the two Latin maxims here of salus populi est suprema lex, or the welfare of the people is the supreme law. And then there's also sic utre tuo ut alienum non aliedas. So use your own as not to injure another's property. So the police power is basically the state exercising certain restraints on individuals, and of course, um, not only restraints on individuals, but also putting parameters as to what can the pub or how can or how should individuals, let's say, conduct their affairs in the context of society, you know, to put it broadly. Okay, so it is exercised primarily in the national legislature, and usually via laws, but it can also be validly exercised as a form of valid delegation by the president, by administrative boards per se, IATF, and any lawmaking bodies on the municipal level when they conduct or when they create ordinances, for example. So there are tests as to how we know that the exercise of police power are actually are actually lawful or actually exercised properly and without abuse. So there's two tests to do this. We have the lawful subject. We ask the question: is the subject or is the object of the exercise of police power validly regarded as of interest to the public, as something that affects public health, public morals, or even safety in general for the public, no? Then there's also lawful means, which means that are the methods used to regulate said activities on behalf of the public, are they meaningful, or rather are they sufficient, or perhaps are they excessive? No? So we ask that, and that is the lawful object must be pursued through a lawful method. It follows the law. Okay, this often happens um, when when policemen, for example, they they often step out of their mandate. No, they often exceed their mandate when they conduct arrests. No, when they when they don't follow procedure. Okay, that usually happens, especially in circumstances wherein there might be certain difficulties in arresting an individual or a group. No? So that's one example I can give you. Okay, so is there proper procedure? Is there due process, as they said, or as they say? Then we go to the exercise of the power of eminent domain. Okay, so eminent domain, or the right of the state um, to expropriate private property for public use upon payment to the owner a just compensation to be ascertained according to law. Remember these: public use and compensation, just compensation. Again, public use and just compensation. These are the things that you need to remember when looking into eminent domain. Okay, so government basically, when they do eminent domain, when they take property from private persons and then turn it into public property to be used by the community, by everyone, basically, there must be just compensation. They must be compensated. Otherwise, that would be illegal, and not only illegal, it would also undermine the legitimacy of the government, its public image, basically. So you can see that the exercise of eminent domain, and even the exercise of police power by extension, is not simply exercised out of whim, but rather it is always exercised with public use and just compensation, or in the case of police power, they there is always due process that is being followed, no? So even in this one, even in eminent domain, there is due process followed. Okay, so that's the idea here. They take property from private individuals and turn it into property intended for public use. Okay, so there are limitations as well. Okay, what are the limitations to the exercise of eminent domain? That is uh, that these are the following limitations, rather. uh, is there a public use for the property being taken by government? Okay, and I think this is perhaps we can even argue that in recent memory, no, this is one of the cases that led to the derailing of then popular Senator Manny Villar and in his bid for the presidency a decade ago, no? So you can see that uh, his C5, or I think C4, C5 road project was actually questioned as to why land was expropriated, and the expropriated land happens to pass through one of his development projects, no? Camellia Homes, basically. somewhere in that area where the road was was being constructed. So that's one argument on that one. I don't know if there's a case on that, but that's one example I can think of um, out of memory, no, from memory that is. So there is payment of just compensation also as a necessary condition in limiting the exercise of eminent domain. So the amount to be paid for the expropriated property shall be determined by the proper court, and it is based on the fair market value at the time of the taking of the property. So that's one that's how it is supposed to be paid. Okay? Now, observance of due process of law in the taking of property is also a condition in limiting the exercise of eminent domain. No due process, the exercise is invalid. Okay. So the taking of property is done in this manner, no? Since eminent domain is about taking of property. Okay. It doesn't have to be physical seizure of property. It doesn't have to be, let's say, government closing off an area and saying this is now public domain, etc., etc. It can be done via, let's say, it can be done, or eminent domain can be used not only for taking property but also for destruction or limitation of certain usage of property as um, as a part of its many forms of exercise, no. So for example, is um, a building is about to collapse, and and lives are at stake, especially when a building is in a commercial area. The government can step in, take that building via eminent domain, and demolish it for the greater good of the residents of those area of that area affected by the collapsing building, no. So that's an exercise of eminent domain. So the taking must also be direct. The constitution does not require that property losses incidental to the exercise of governmental power be compensated for. Okay, I think that's very straightforward. Okay, so who may exercise the power of eminent domain? Primarily, it is lodged in Congress. Then, of course, by delegation, President of the Philippines, various local legislative bodies, aka LGUs. And then we have public corporations that can also expropriate eminent domain via valid delegation as well. Okay, so there are government-controlled corporations that do this, especially when it comes to infrastructure projects that require lands to be expropriated by government to build in various infrastructure ranging from bridges to reclamation areas to road buildings, etc., etc. Okay. So these are the requisites for the taking of property in eminent domain. So the expropriator must enter a private property. So they cannot expropriate public property, of course. It must be private property. Then the entry must be for more than a momentary period. Okay? Then the entry must be under warrant or color of legal authority. There must be due process, basically. And then the property must be devoted to public use. Okay, remember that. Public use. Okay, if it is not for public use, then you are not exercising eminent domain properly. Okay? Case in point, the Villar example I gave earlier. So, the property must be devoted to public use or otherwise informally appropriated or injuriously affected. Okay. So, these are the terms that we covered earlier. Please remember them as they are crucial. Then we go to the concept of taxation, okay, or the power of taxation. So the power of taxation is the means by which taxes, the lifeblood of any government, is taken from individuals, from families, from small businesses to large corporations, as a means to continue the operations of the state. So taxation is important in the sense that this is the state trying to sustain itself via the contributions of its many numerous members in Philippine society. Okay? So governments cannot exist without taxes, right? So in this way, that taxes are 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 levied, or rather they are gathered, no, they are taken, no, the collection of taxes is used for public purposes. Raising revenues is for public purposes. So how can you maintain, for example, the military that keeps order, that keeps that keeps um, armed rebels, for example, in check, if there are no taxes? How can you maintain public hospitals if there are no taxes? How can you maintain the basic infrastructures of governments such as roads, water works, bridges, railways, electricity lines, internet connections, etc.? How can you keep them operational without taxes? So in general, we can claim that taxes are charges imposed by governments. Okay, they are charges or obligations imposed by governments so that governments continue to function and serve their intended public purposes. Okay. So the basis for taxation is, of course, it is necessary for the existence of governments, and it is a reciprocal duty between people and their governments, no, people and the state. And with that, we end our presentation for this afternoon. I did promise you about syntaxes, no? So let's before we end our presentation, let's go back to taxation. Are syntaxes considered as, let's say, taxation? Well, taxing, for example, taxing alcoholic drinks, for example, is not simply meant to raise revenues for the coffers of government, no, for the treasury of the government, but rather it is meant as a means to control the vices of individuals, particularly those who are considered as alcoholics, in order to deter them from buying their favorite vice, no, from buying alcoholic drinks and excessively drinking them. So the idea of a sin tax, and I think it was first proposed many years ago by the late Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago. The idea of a sin tax is very critical for it's an exercise, first and foremost, not of taxation but of police power, not to limit access to these alcoholic drinks, to these drinks that make people intoxicated. So in this way, we are seeing that taxation was used as a form of police power. But also there's the added benefit of raising revenue for public purposes as well. And it has inspired many other legislations. In particular, I am keen to support this legislation, or at least even on the local level, perhaps an ordinance on sugar taxes to limit or to discourage the public from buying so much or so many uh, energy drinks and soft drinks that are really causes of obesity and diabetes in the country. And the promotion of public health is certainly a public good that we can rally upon, no? Or we can rally behind on. So in this way, if we are imaginative enough, perhaps we can think of solutions to many problems that we face in society today via means of policies that take advantage of the inherent powers of the state. And that's the end of my presentation for today. Thank you for listening. If you have any comments or suggestions, please put them in the comment section and I'll gladly read and respond to them in the appropriate time. Thank you for listening and I'll see you next time.